Measurement is a part of our everyday lives. Each time we get on a scale or take a blood pressure reading, we're carefully measuring a variable that's important to us as individuals. In society, there are also variables that we regularly measure, and such measurement often affects large numbers of people. For example, the cleanliness of our streets or poverty are important public issues that affect the lives of millions of citizens, affect the policies we propose, and the way tax dollars get spent. Professors Dahlia Remler and Gregg Ryzin are public affairs researchers who note that measurement in the public arena can often be complex. Yet, it's essential to good public policy decisions.
Government agencies need to measure things to see what they need to work on and to see if their programs have worked.
And that's just what New York City did about clean streets over 4 decades ago. But unlike blood pressure or weight,
it's multidimensional, it's harder to define what actually is street cleanliness.
So the city began by asking residents what clean streets meant.
No trash on the ground and no clutter in the middle of the street, and then no smell.
I would say a clean street would be free from debris.
A clean street is a street that doesn't have a lot of litter.
You really can't measure it.
But the city felt it could measure litter. However, precise scientific measurement requires an operational definition. How would you define litter on the streets?
Middle of the street on the curb, is it on the sidewalk, and how much of that counts?
Alternatively, you could measure the number of people hired by the city as street sweepers, or the average amount of time they spend sweeping.
So you'd love to measure all of these things to get a really good measure of the street, holistic measure of the street cleanliness. That's really expensive and very, very time consuming.
And the city already spends over $1 billion per year just cleaning streets. So New York City made a decision.
They went through a process of taking photographs.
The photos were ranked from least clean to most clean.
Those became a standard, a photographic standard that was then used to train raters.
Today, raters carry handheld phones and compare their judgments to the standards. But this definition of street cleanliness is very narrow, as it only focuses on litter specifically in the street, as opposed to broadening the definition to include other areas.
So we'll have a less valid measure.
And while the definition may be less valid, less inclusive, the precise but narrow photographic standard used results in high reliability among raters.
Given that you have limited resources, you have to think about this validity-reliability trade-off.
And Ryzin's research shows that New York City's efforts are working. Over time, as street cleanliness ratings have risen, so has resident satisfaction.
Not like the old days, you used to walk by and there'd be trash all over the place, and I think it's improved a lot since even in the past 5 years or so, I would say.
But while street cleanliness has improved in New York City, what's gotten worse both here and across the nation is the poverty rate. This graph shows government statistics on poverty.
The number of people in poverty over time rising to 46.2 million, but it's very important to look at how the government defines and measures poverty.
It was Molly Orshansky who created the official poverty definition more than half a century ago.
She knew there was a lot of controversy, so she sort of said, well, everyone can agree that you need to have enough to eat.
Food costs back then used up about 1/3 of a family's budget.
And so they just took that, multiplied it by 3, and said if you have that, you have enough.
Amazingly, the definition has changed very little since then.
They just took that old thing and they just updated it for inflation.
But since the 1950s, food prices have come down dramatically, while other costs have risen, causing some critics to be
stunned and appalled at the official measure. Instead, people want to look at a genuine measure of necessities, price it, see what it is, agree on that, and use that.
Today, a supplemental poverty measure addresses several flaws in the official poverty measure by counting some non-cash sources of income.
You can't just look at the income that I've earned and see if I'm poor. You also have to see if the government gave me food stamps or housing vouchers or other things like that.
But surprisingly, non-cash healthcare contributions like Medicare and Medicaid are not counted.
And so I'm concerned, we're not really accurately measuring poverty because we're missing out on this important dimension of poverty. And that's a validity issue.
Another issue is whether poverty should be considered absolute or relative.
Is poverty a relative concept? Am I poor if I'm so much worse off than other people, no matter what I have? Or do we have an absolute standard for poverty?
Recall that Orshansky utilized an absolute standard, which still applies today.
This issue of relative poverty is one that's, I think, quite politically controversial, and people don't agree about that.
What we can agree about is that measuring public policy variables can be complex, and Remler and Ryzin have important take-home messages.
The first thing to understand is to really think very, very clearly about what you want to measure.
Look behind the scenes, see how the measurement is produced, and you need to be a critical consumer of those sorts of statistics. There are strengths and weaknesses to almost every measurement that the government or any agency or the media report on, and I think understanding those strengths and weaknesses is an important skill.